Chapter 2. The hunger pains left Jason weak and tired, and his muscles were stale from lack of use. Both issues caused his writing hand to shake and cramp, but he wrote like someone on the clock, and he most certainly was. After all, while he had no idea when stepmother would be back to turn off the light each day, he knew it was most certainly coming. He estimated by her cadence in turning the light on and off, and occasionally bringing a sample of food or water, that 4 or 5 days had gone by since he was given the notebook. He would spend his days rotating between sleeping and daydreaming about the world outside. While it had been a week or so since his incarceration, it felt like the entire world outside was passing by at light speed. He began to imagine his classmates all grown up, and even his sisters being older and wiser. He was weak, and sleep came much easier and more often as each day went by. The skin on his face was dry and sunken, and when he'd move his mouth, it felt like he could literally rip the dried flesh from his face. It was like putting a child's glove on a man's hand. Move enough, and you can just rip it to pieces. Sometimes Jason couldn't write or draw because his hands would shake violently. It was frustrating as he wanted to take advantage of every minute he had with the light on. He'd calm himself down the best he could and try to keep a steady hand. From time to time, he'd shove a piece of paper in his mouth to have something to chew on. After it was ground down enough, he'd swallow it. He wasn't sure, but he felt like the balls of paper were getting stuck in his stomach, and he was no longer able to form a bowel movement in those final days. It didn't matter because his mouth was so dry that he soon found out that there was virtually nothing he could do to chew or swallow paper. He learned this lesson the hard way when a sliver of it got stuck in his throat, and he spent the better part of the day hacking and gagging trying to release it. There was a steady drip of water cascading down the foundation to his right, suggesting that the water level was rising outside, and a fierce storm was overhead. It was the ultimate in torture, as he couldn't get to it to quench his thirst. Devoid of lightning, a storm would normally be hard to identify sitting in the basement all day and night, so the water was unusual. Jason didn't just spend those days writing. He took to drawing pictures as well. He would draw cans and boxes and stairs and light bulbs and items that were familiar to his immediate surroundings, and curiously, all items that had some form of spatial dimensions and depth. Cubes, cylinders, spheres, things with immense forms of shading. Perhaps it was a way to make a seemingly simple drawing a little more complex and a little more consuming. He eventually evolved these drawings into things that he wanted to remember. The main street of buildings in Niobrara, including the one in which he smashed the main window, were drawn nearly to perfection based on his mental recollections. He could draw each tree almost down to the leaf. On and on, he drew three-dimensional maps of areas in and around Niobrara. The school, his home, the rivers he illustrated in flood state, creeping up on buildings and farms and covering roads. He drew a map of the town as seen from the crow's eye, and some would say in the years following the tragedy that he had a photographic memory and a keen gift for recalling things to perfection that he might have only seen once. Some days he would close his eyes and wish for the rivers to just overflow and drown out his home. At least he could get a drink, he thought. Maybe if he drowned, he would finally be free. He would take a few enormous gulps of river water to quench his thirst, and then he'd simply breathe in the liquid, and, if anything, he would never again know the pain that comes with being so dry. Thunder pretty much kept to himself during those long days in the basement. He would raise his head and bare his teeth to threaten Jason, or at least let him know who was boss when it came time to feed, even though Jason devoured his one small clump of food faster than Thunder could take a bite. His portions usually consisted of what his stepmother would call 3 fingers. Essentially, she took the ring, index, and middle finger and formed a scoop, and with that scoop, she'd shovel a small clump of dog food Jason's way. It was the highlight of his day, and he began to look forward to it like Christmas. As the days went by, though, eating became a double-edged sword. He still couldn't produce a bowel movement, and each clump of food, regardless of how small, was sure to become a raging pain soon after he ate it. That alone couldn't stop him from eating whatever she provided. It was a pain he was willing to take. Stepmother didn't get involved with his drawings or writings. She couldn't care less, and as long as he wasn't whining and was being quiet, that's all that mattered. The least amount of time she spent in the basement with Thunder and Jason, the better. Maybe she had a tinge of guilt within her that lessened under the old saying, out of sight, out of mind. Perhaps she felt magnanimous in providing a little bit of light and means to write and draw, and that was worthy of balancing her guilt. Jason never saw his father or his sisters during this time. It's as if they forgot he even existed. He had dreams that his oldest sister would visit him in the night, but they were merely flashes of thought that disappeared just as quickly. School was never far from Jason's mind. He missed his classmates, even though they would probably say his absence was more of a relief. How else could you explain the lack of concern when he disappeared for so long? Jason wondered at times if anyone would come for him, or if anyone at the school ever wondered when he would come back. Truth be told, it wasn't the first time Jason was pulled from school for long periods of time, and no one wanted to mess with stepmother or father. They were just too abrasive and dominant. Jason began writing short stories about the school. He'd sometimes put himself in the role of a hero, saving all the little people from danger. In the end, he always got the girl, always named that girl Heidi, and always came out the victor. His drawings were so precise that he could stare at them for hours, using the little bit of light he could find to mentally escape his incarceration, imagining himself outside running through the trees and swimming in the river. In his mind, he would put himself in the future and think about a time when he may look back and see his confinement as a source of strength and creativity. Other times, many other times, he'd simply succumb to his predicament and cry. There just weren't enough tears to compensate for what he was truly going through. The thought of the basement flooding during that time was an unbearable notion. What would he do? Where would he go? It was storm season, and he knew it was a possibility. Perhaps it would be best if he were to drown in that cell, amongst the collections of discarded Christmas decorations, old dishes, clothes, and dusty things otherwise deemed of no use to the family. Maybe he had something in common with Thunder after all. It was the two of them discarded in that basement like the items of days gone by. The water continued to drip down the walls of the foundation, growing more intense by the hour. Jason watched as it first began to collect on the floor in small puddles before it started to fill the basement like a bathtub. Stacks of cardboard boxes collapsed and fell into the water as the ones on the bottom soaked and became weakened. Why wasn't anyone upstairs coming to help? They must have heard the crashing of boxes and the shattering of glass as they tumbled down. Jason began to fear the water. He'd stare at his drawings and imagine himself on Walnut Street on a sunny summer day. Life must have been dreadful outside as the water kept rushing in. Was the house being flooded by the nearby waters of the raging Missouri, or was it simply raining like mad? It didn't take much for the water table to rise, as the river's edge was literally a stone's throw from the porch. Maybe that was it. Thunder wasn't too thrilled with the rising waters either, and took to scratching and clawing at the door leading to the main part of the house. No one came this time. Maybe Thunder felt his place in the world in those moments. His life wasn't any more valuable to the Thorne family than Jason's. More than likely, he was just a dog that knew well enough to get to safety. The lights flickered and the house began to shake above the two of them as Jason's heart fluttered nervously. This was something unique and unexpected. Dust cascaded from the rafters above him as he could feel the house swaying, its wooden shell creaking like a ship at sea. Something bad was happening outside, and for the first time he could remember, he wasn't quite sure if he even wanted to leave the basement for whatever was causing such commotion. Maybe he was actually safe in his jail cell. The sounds got louder, and the house continued to sway above him. Lonely and scared, Jason had nowhere to go. "Help!" he yelled. "What's happening up there? Please, don't leave me down here." The water level was dangerously high, probably 4 or 5 feet deep, and certainly full enough to drown the boy if he somehow fell in the mess. He couldn't escape if he wanted to, but really felt a wave of helplessness watching Thunder, a usually stoic and dominant creature, shake and shiver on the top step. This must have been how third-class passengers on the Titanic felt. "Oh no," Jason said, as the power finally went out completely. He was very comfortable with darkness, having been placed in it so often, but this was a different kind of black. Darkness and rising water aren't exactly the most complimentary of uncomfortable environments to be placed in. It was pitch black all around. "Thunder? Thunder, where are you?" Silence. The house stopped creaking, and the cascading water seemed to also stop for a moment, receding to a mere trickle. What was happening? Just as quickly, Jason was startled by a loud explosion. Thunder leapt from his spot near the door and jumped into the water, paddling his way towards Jason. Boxes, anything that he could get to. The house shook violently as the door to the upper floor was ripped from its frame. The snapping of boards and crashing of furniture above was deafening. The only way Jason could protect himself from the madness above was to curl up in a ball and cover his head. Boards and other debris smashed into him from all directions, and he no longer knew where Thunder was, or if he was even still alive. A wicked wind blew all around Jason as he looked up to see Thunder still struggling in the water. He noticed the ceiling that once encased him in his cell was mostly gone, and there was a rush of dust and debris above. Thunder reached the broken stairs and pathetically climbed up to them before he disappeared to where the entrance from the basement to the main part of the house once stood. Unable to fight such forces, Jason was lifted from the basement and pulled into the air. Complete chaos encapsulated him, and he had no control of his fate. With such fierce wind and so much debris, Jason struggled just to breathe. He couldn't open his eyes, but knew that he wasn't on solid ground. What a feeling it was, levitating in the sky with nothing below you is a surreal experience, and for Jason, it was like he was experiencing it through someone else's body. There was no pain, and, oddly, he wasn't scared for the brief time he floated there. If this was the end of his life, at least he was free and away from the house. It was almost a happy ending. A downdraft of air grabbed Jason and threw him back to the basement, where he cannonballed into the water with great force, barely missing the submerged furnace. What a weird dichotomy, going from weightlessness to the dry air to weightlessness in the darkness of murky water. Jason inhaled liquid and began to panic. Where was he? Which way was up? Flailing and flopping in the water, he finally got his bearings enough to know where the surface was, and as soon as his head was above water, he coughed and gagged and spit to get air. His lungs burned from the intrusion of filthy liquid. Whatever was happening, it wasn't quite over yet, as the wind above was almost as volatile as the water below. Still bombarded by flying debris, Jason paddled himself to a corner where some of the ceiling above still stood. He lifted his arms and grasped a pipe attached to the rafters and held on for dear life. Just like that, the wind stopped, and with it, a massive barrage of broken boards and ripped furniture splashed into the water around him. The wind faded, and he could finally see, although not as much as he would have liked. It was late in the day, and the overcast sky allowed some light in, but not much. Jason let go of the pipe and swam to where the stairs were barely hanging onto the foundation. As he attempted to climb out, he realized that there was something wrong with his back. The lack of movement for the previous few weeks, mixed with the tossing he received, dislocated something in his spine and was causing him great discomfort. Still, he pressed on, climbing from the basement to where the main house used to be. He didn't care if stepmother was there, or father, or his sisters. He didn't care if Thunder was waiting for him just to bare his teeth and act like the alpha male. He just wanted to be out of the basement and away from the alarming rush of water. But oh, how his back ached. It sent shockwaves of pain up and down all 4 limbs with each movement. What he found when he reached the ground floor was shocking. Not just a disaster area, but complete devastation. The windows weren't just broken, they were disintegrated. The walls weren't just crushed, they were completely gone. It was as if he just climbed out of a swimming pool. The people, his family, just like the refrigerator, were nowhere to be found. Jason crawled carefully down the line of the home's cement foundation, as most of the floor was missing. He had to get out of the dangerous shell of a building he used to call home. Once he got to the edge and was able to walk into his front yard, he looked up to see a powerful tornado ripping its way to the east, following the Missouri River like a highway. To think he had only moments earlier been inside of it. The thought sent a shiver down his injured spine. Looking at his house, it was perplexing. Where was the debris? How could such a storm literally take with it every piece of his family's life? It was like a child came along and cleaned off a Tootsie Pop, leaving behind nothing but the bare stick. He noticed quite frantically and with a wave of terror rushing through his body that both the Niobrara and Missouri rivers were rising rapidly and well past flood stage. The waters had reached the edge of his home without bias and were still closing in. Everyone else had relocated at some point, but the Thorns stayed true to their home and where it originally stood. Just spitting distance from the Missouri to the north, it was a common point of debate as to who was dumber, the people who built it or the people who continued to live there. Now it was a moot point, as the house was gone and the river was claiming the foundation. In a matter of moments, it would be impossible for anyone to realize that the home once stood there. With no time to waste, Jason began limping towards town, his back screaming at him with every step. The pain in his leg was a new sensation to him, like bolts of lightning streaming from his hip to his toes. It was both annoying and extremely painful, and his pace was slow and steady as he essentially had to drag his leg along like an extra body. He had to get to town and get help. Living as far away from Niobrara as one could and still be considered a resident, it wasn't as easy as just walking to a neighbor's house. There was some effort involved. In Jason's case, it was life or death. It was becoming dusk, and the impending lack of light weighed heavy on Jason's mind as he wondered what to do. The clouds above were still thick and dark gray, making it even harder to see. It had been so long since he'd seen the sky, the blue sky, the sun. He knew that the waters were rising from the Niobrara to his right and the Missouri to his rear. Soon, the two would converge where he stood, and the entire area would become a shallow lake. He didn't just need to get to town and find help for his injury and mistreatment. He needed to get out of that field to avoid getting stuck and drowning. With darkness and pain consuming him, Jason began to slow down drastically. It was as if he were encased in cement, as he could no longer find the energy or strength to move his legs. What could he do? The water level all around him was rising, and the ground he was walking on became a thick trough of mud. If he could make it to the tree line in the distance, he could at least rely on the forest to help block him from the elements. The dogs were known to have a den somewhere near the confluences of the river, and it was sure to be underwater. They were often found roaming the very same tree line that he was trying to get to. Honestly, Jason didn't care if the dogs were there. When someone is frantically trying to escape the unknown of Mother Nature's wrath, it becomes less of a stress worrying about things that aren't an immediate danger. A man on fire would gladly jump into a tank full of alligators. It was all a moot point, as he knew there was no way he could make it by dark or before his body gave out. In a last wave of effort, he picked up his heavy, mud-caked foot and crashed headfirst into the muddy muck below. His face half submerged in the goo, he lay there like a woolly mammoth trapped in a tar pit, forming a small hole in the uppermost crack of his mouth to allow air in and out. The taste of dirt covered his tongue, but he didn't care. He'd tasted worse. He didn't care if he died there, just as long as he didn't have to walk another step. The rising waters didn't care that he had given up on his trek, and he could feel the mud turning to liquid as he lay there in the quickly diluting mess. In a last gasp of survival, Jason released his elbows, lifted his torso, and army crawled on his belly through the mud, trying in glorious futility to at least put up a fight against the rising waters. Left, right. He powered his elbows into the mud and swished his hips to gain ground on the impending doom, traveling a few yards in the process. He thought about his old house and imagined that the skeleton of a foundation that remained must have been completely submerged at that point. He wondered if he'd be happier at that point, had he stayed in the basement and succumbed to the floodwaters. At least the fight would be over. For days he dreamed about being given a chance to fight for his freedom, and now that he was there, looking it right in the face, he was too weak and injured to do anything about it. Where was that fight? Where was the spirit of survival that he knew he had in him? In many cases, the spirit to live doesn't stand a chance against the limitations of the body, especially one as broken as Jason's. With no other options and no way to continue in his condition, he stopped crawling, and just as quickly powered his face into the mud and water. He was spent, and nothing he did could stop him from drowning in the creamy water. It was over. All he could do was hold his breath as long as possible. Once he released his lungs, they would fill with muddy water, and he would die. Just as he turned off all thoughts and succumbed to his fate, he was lifted by his armpits by someone with great strength. He took his right hand and gingerly wiped the mud from his face to take a breath. The sensation of inhaling water and mud caused him to violently cough. What was happening? Was he being saved? And if so, by whom? "Come on, get to your feet," a voice said. "It's going to be okay. Let's walk. Can you walk?" Jason casually shook his head. The mysterious rescuer got Jason to a point where he could at least wrap his arm around his neck and walk him out of the muddy tomb. The two made a beeline for the trees in hopes of reaching them before it became completely dark out. In a place like Niobrara, you don't have the benefit of reflective light from town. Once it gets dark, it's as black as a cave, and the dogs like it that way. You might think you know where you're walking, but one misstep into a gopher hole and you break an ankle. Jason blacked out off and on while he was walking and eventually woke to somewhat dry land after his rescuer gently rested him on his back. He looked up to see the rustling leaves on a tree barely visible in the darkness above him, his eyes burning from the dirty water which had pooled over his eyelids. "We're going to stay here till morning," a voice said to Jason. "There's no reason to keep moving in towards town. You're just too heavy to carry around anyway, at least in the dark." "Where are we?" Jason asked, scratching shards of dried mud off of his face, trying to clear the crust from around his eyes in particular. "We're in the old cottonwood tree line just down from your house," said the voice. "How do you know where I live?" Jason asked. "Who are you?" "Name's Mike, but you can call me Lem," he said. "I don't know no Lem," Jason said, trying to get a good look at Lem's face. "Do you go to school in Niobrara?" "You don't even go to school in Niobrara," the boy joked. Jason knew what he meant. Even though Niobrara elementary and secondary schools combined for an enrollment of a little more than 100 kids, it was like they were all best friends and on a first-name basis. In Jason's case, it was even worse. He thought about it and realized that he probably knew about 5 people at the school by their first name, so it was a moot point even asking this kid. He never really stopped to care about them, and they most certainly didn't give 2 biscuits about him. "You're going to be all right, buddy," Lem said. "We'll go to town in the morning and find out what the heck is going on." Jason was beyond exhaustion and certainly wasn't going to argue. All he wanted was to close his eyes and enjoy a few moments of uninterrupted sleep. Truth be told, he was somewhat happy to be under the clouds. Despite his horrible back pain, wet clothes, and mud-caked skin, he was still more comfortable than he was being crammed in that hellhole he had been in for so long. Fresh air was the best. He sat there and breathed in the scent of wet leaves and rain, and it was exceptional. The next day he would be so much better. He'd get to town and find help. Maybe someone would take him away from his family in Niobrara, and he'd be able to enjoy life for the first time. He would finally eat. By God, he would finally eat. "We'll get some food tomorrow, too," Lem said, as if reading Jason's thoughts. "I don't know about you, but I'm starving." "Yeah, me too," said Jason, almost embarrassed for Lem in not knowing just how deprived of food he had been over the past weeks. He didn't have the courage to tell Lem just how hungry he was and what he'd endured for who knows how long, and that he was literally starving. He probably wouldn't have believed it anyway. Hunger had become a secondary issue to simple survival. Hunger, despite its importance in everyday life, had been secondary to freedom on Jason's mind. He just wanted to be free, to breathe fresh air. As he lay under the chilly, cloudy sky, he took more deep breaths. It was beautiful. "I just want to live," said Jason. "We'll be all right," said Lem, cupping his hands behind his head to make a pillow. "Just gotta wait till morning."